Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so continuing our character explanation series, what I want to do here is I want to talk about the character of Vulcan, about Gabriel Summers. I want to do an explanation on him. And the reason why is because with House and Powers of X going on, one of the things that you guys are aware of is that Gabriel Summers is currently back in Marvel Comics as part of the X-Men lineup. The issue with this is that the last time we saw him, he was effectively a villain, right? And so for him to suddenly be thrown back in and then to essentially be a good guy really sort of rings a few bells here and there. But Gabriel Summers, Vulcan, first appeared back in X-Men Deadly Genesis #1 in 2006, and he was created by Ed Brubaker. Now, the idea of X-Men Deadly Genesis, like kind of getting into this, I want to have this sort of discussion about the X-Men, right? And we've kind of talked about this before, so for those of you guys who have followed my X-Men videos very closely, bear with me for a minute while we talk about this. The publication history of the X-Men and Marvel was always pretty straightforward, right? It was always relatively straightforward, at least until you got into like the early to mid 2000s, and then you started getting into name changes, right? Like X-Men Legacy and all that kind of good stuff. It got kind of crazy. But the idea was that back in the early days, you had Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's X-Men, and this lineup was pretty basic, right? You had Jean Grey, you had Cyclops, you had Iceman, you had Angel, and you had Beast. And that was basically it, right? That's really all you had. That original lineup and the stories that were told were not resoundingly popular. And so Marvel basically got rid of them in 1975 when they released Giant Size X-Men #1. Well, I wouldn't really say they got rid of them so much as they added to them. The landscape of the country had changed in a lot of ways, so people were really clamoring for more diversity in their characters. And so what you got was this essential multicultural X-Men team. The result of that is that the way this set of events originally played out is you basically had the original X-Men who were captured by the living island of Krakoa, and they were rescued by a new X-Men team that was created by Charles Xavier, basically consisting of Wolverine and Storm and Colossus and Nightcrawler, and pretty much all the characters that you're the most familiar with these days. Following that, both the original team and the new team merged together and then went forward throughout the entirety of Chris Claremont's run, with certain members being kicked out, namely the original team, more or less being kicked out. Cyclops left the team after the death of Jean Grey at the end of the Phoenix and the Dark Phoenix sagas. Iceman and Angel ended up joining the Defenders of Los Angeles. Beast joined the Avengers themselves. So they were all kind of being ushered out more or less. And so all you really had was the roster of Giant Size X-Men being published as the Uncanny X-Men lineup. This ran for quite some time. And the reason why this matters is because X-Men Deadly Genesis, while it shares the namesake of Giant Size X-Men #1, this was basically a giant retcon, right? Retroactive continuity, insofar as it was designed to introduce information that didn't exist before. But the other reason for its creation was to totally revamp the leadership of the X-Men and to hand it over to Cyclops. And the reason why was because, as we talked about before, following the comic bust and a lot of the financial struggles that Marvel was going through, Joe Quesada taking over as editor-in-chief, the issue was that the X-Men specifically had almost kind of gotten out of control insofar as you had all kinds of name changes and you had all these crazy things going on and you had this huge explosion of the mutant population and you had characters who were dying all the time and it was getting kind of bonkers. And so Quesada's response was basically like condense the X-Men number down, right? Like wipe out all the ones that we don't really need and only keep the essentials. And so that's why you got House of M, where 98% of the mutant population lost their powers. But the idea here was to also move the X-Men away from the leadership of Charles Xavier, who had essentially been head of the team, been like the leader of the team pretty much since its inception. As a result of that, Quesada and really a handful of others said, let's get Xavier out and let's have somebody else take over. Hence the reason why we got X-Men Deadly Genesis. And what this did is it introduced the idea that where we previously believed that the original X-Men were rescued by the Giant Size X-Men #1 team, that what Xavier had done is he had actually secretly created another team that we didn't know existed. And this team was composed of like Vulcan and Darwin and so on and so forth. And ultimately they were all destroyed by Krakoa with the exception of Vulcan and Darwin. And Darwin, because he had the mutant ability to adapt to any situation, had basically bonded himself to Vulcan, and then in turn, Vulcan had kind of lived on. But the way that this played out was that when this whole thing went down, when this whole situation kind of popped up, Vulcan just sort of appeared seemingly out of nowhere. And what we ended up learning was that his arrival, his return more or less, basically came by way of the fact that so many mutants had lost their powers. This kind of psychic shockwave had woken him up, and he had basically been out in space the entire time within the island of Krakoa, which in the original Giant Size X-Men comics had been shot into space by Jean Grey. And so when he came back here, he didn't really have any recollection of who he was or what his memories were or anything along those lines. And Brubaker played this pretty incredible, actually. Over the course of the X-Men Deadly Genesis comics, what you end up learning is that in the old school origin of Cyclops, the scenario played out whereby Cyclops and his family were essentially in a plane. They were going on a family retreat or something along those lines, and their plane was suddenly set upon by essentially the Shi'ar, this kind of space spacefaring, alien empire. And the result was that Cyclops and Havoc were pushed out of the plane and given parachutes, and then it was believed that his father Corsair and his mother had died. Now, during Chris Claremont's run, it was revealed that Corsair was actually alive, but the result was that what we ended up learning from X-Men Deadly Genesis is that the mother of Cyclops was pregnant with a third son. And so ultimately this son was essentially taken from her, and then when Corsair tried to make an attempt to escape, the mother was killed. And so it was a way to basically explain why it is that the mother of Cyclops and them had never been around, despite the fact that Corsair was around. Following this, Vulcan's origin basically played out in such a way to where he was artificially aged up, and then he was sent to Earth. And the idea behind this was that at the time, Earth was really being monitored by a guy named Devon Shikari, who also operated under the mantle of Eric the Red. He was essentially an agent of Emperor Dakin, who was the guy that was leading the Shi'ar Empire at the time. And Vulcan was sent to Earth in order to be his servant, more or less, in order to carry out the various schemes and so on that Eric the Red wanted to implement. The issue with this, and really the way this played out, really kind of came to a head in a couple different ways. The first way was that when Vulcan arrived on the scene, he was discovered by Moira McTaggart, who was a friend of Charles Xavier and a mutant geneticist. And Moira McTaggart didn't really know what to make of the powers of Vulcan, and so the result was that she brought him under her wing and studied his abilities. The second thing about this is this all kind of coincided with the capture of the original X-Men team by the living island of Krakoa. And so as a result of that, Xavier had basically traveled to Moira McTaggart, learning that she had various mutants under her purview, recruited them to his cause, and then sent them there. Now, the idea behind Moira McTaggart at the time was she disagreed with the idea, right? She didn't like that because she felt like they weren't trained well enough, that Charles Xavier was sending them on a suicide mission. And where Xavier used his abilities to essentially speed up their training by having them engage in battles that were all fought on kind of a psychic plane, believing that it would really train them up to the level they needed to be in order to rescue the original X-Men. Ultimately, it didn't work. And so this basically led into what we talked about before, whereby all the secret X-Men, as we'll call them, were killed off by Krakoa except for Darwin and Vulcan. And so with that having been the case, this all really kind of came together and coalesced with the launch of Giant Size X-Men. And this goes into the desire to replace Charles Xavier. Because Charles Xavier had been old hat, because he was kind of looked at as, okay, this guy's been leading the team forever, but like we want to shift things up, we want to change things. The idea was to begin the process of moving in the direction of Cyclops taking over the X-Men. But the problem is you couldn't just have it happen one day, right? Because the way the Cyclops character had been written over the years is he was like the believer. He was the guy who always believed in what Xavier was espousing, the idea of a peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, and he would lay his life on the line to ensure that dream came to fruition. And so when the events of House of M transpired and 98% of the mutant population lost their powers, Xavier was nowhere to be found, and Cyclops and Emma Frost were the ones who took over the X-Men team. Had there not been a reason for Cyclops to doubt the leadership of Xavier, then as soon as Xavier came back, Cyclops would have handed the mantle right back over and it would have been right back to business as usual. And so the purpose behind this story was to essentially seed doubt. It was to basically bring to light this revelation that Charles Xavier had a secret X-Men team, one of which he knew was the brother of Cyclops, and never told him. Not only that, seemingly sent him on a suicide mission. And so once X-Men Deadly Genesis came to an end and Vulcan was essentially defeated, which by the way, you were welcome to check that video out here on my channel. I've got it so you can watch the whole thing. But once that story came to an end and Vulcan was essentially defeated and basically took off into space when he learned that the true killer of his mother was basically Emperor Dakin, this had two big ramifications. The first, and the part that we're going to follow here as we're going through the explanation of Vulcan, is that he took off into space to go after the Shi'ar. The second is that as far as the mainline X-Men comics went, this led Cyclops to believe that really Xavier was essentially a duplicitous man, right? That he was a dubious man because he had kept so many secrets. And so that set the stage for Cyclops to basically refuse to allow leadership of the X-Men for Xavier, a lot of the other X-Men to really follow suit behind Cyclops, and for him to take over that leadership role going forward, which really led all the way up to the death of Xavier during the events of Avengers vs. X-Men. But for Vulcan himself, following the events of X-Men Deadly Genesis, this went into really a pretty significant run for his character, which was called the rise and fall of the Shi'ar Empire. Now, for the first half of the story, and because of the fact that Marvel was sort of gambling on the idea that a lot of people were going to be getting into the X-Men following the events of House of M, and were most likely unfamiliar with the stories of Chris Claremont, really Marvel kind of treated the rise and fall of the Shi'ar Empire as kind of a introduction into what the Shi'ar Empire were, insofar as they were largely an avian race, insofar as they looked like birds, or at least had bird-like features, feathers, different things like that, as well as the structure of leadership, in the sense that where Dakin had been leader during the time when Vulcan's mother was kidnapped in the very, very early days of the X-Men, Dakin had long since been defeated and was basically in a comatose state. And so as a result of this, the entire empire was being ruled over by Lilandra, who had really been the one to take over following the events of the original Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas, the initial defeat of Dakin. This basically led to kind of an informational kind of structure, which made sense because the entire story arc is around 12 issues long. Once you get into the second half, that's when Vulcan started to make his moved. Vulcan actually ended up falling in love, or at least, temporarily in somewhat of a romantic relationship with a character named Deathbird, who was basically the sister of Lilandra, who had always been plotting to overthrow Lilandra anyway. But during that entire set of events, because the X-Men were kind of in a position where Xavier's powers hadn't yet returned or anything like that, it was kind of this huge sequence of events that really shifted the landscape in a lot of different ways. And so Xavier was essentially exposed to the M'Kraan crystal by Vulcan, which basically restored his powers. Daken was killed, and then Vulcan took over the Empire. And so as a result of that, Vulcan was now the de facto leader of the Shi'ar going forward, which worked because for the most part, I mean, aside from super hardcore fans who had been reading since the era of Chris Claremont, most people were new, right? Most people who had been reading the X-Men up to that point had picked up in the mid to late 90s and really weren't too satisfied with what they were seeing. And so what they were getting at this point was really kind of a huge explosion, with regards to what they saw before. But what this did is it basically tied into a lot of the events. It really began to kind of shift away from what was going on explicitly with the X-Men and actually began to shift into everything that was going on with Dan Abnett. Now, to talk about this for a second, Marvel's cosmic landscape as it exists now did not used to be that way. Really before 2006, Marvel's cosmic landscape, while it did exist, was really more of a sequence of stories involving particular characters as opposed to like one great big cohesive opera. You looked at stories like Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War, so on and so forth, and those were big crossover events. And then even then you looked at runs of like Adam Warlock by Jim Starlin. You looked at like these various things that took place, and it was largely revolving around individual characters. Wendell Von Quasar, the original Captain Marvel of the Kree, but it wasn't like this massive set of events that you looked at and was like, this all takes place in space. That all changed in 2006 with a story called Annihilation. And Annihilation was basically designed to kind of consolidate all these spacefaring characters and then bring them all into a single event that would basically catapult and go into a sequence of massive events, all of which took place in space. And so what this did is it went into a sequence of stories. You basically had War of Kings, you had Realm of Kings, different things along those lines, but all of this really kicked off with essentially a giant civil war that took place inside the Shi'ar Empire itself. Now, by this point, the character of Vulcan had been taken over by Christopher Yost, right? He and Craig Kyle had basically made their bones in the X-Men Evolution with the introduction of X-23 and really struck a chord as the potential that they could produce as far as comics went in Marvel proper. And so as a result of that, Marvel basically started producing this comic called X-Men Emperor Vulcan, which basically focused explicitly on what it was that Gabriel Summers was doing between the time that he took off and I guess really, the events of Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire going into basically War of Kings. And during this time, the way he was written was really more of a character insofar that he was rejected by the Shi'ar, who were very much a society that didn't want anybody outside the Shi'ar itself to rule them. And so what ended up happening as part of the story is there was a group that was introduced that were basically called the M'Kraan. Now, at the time the story was made, they were called the Shi'ar, I think is what it was. But basically the gist behind this is that in Marvel Comics, you have what's called the M'Kraan crystal. And we've talked about that before, insofar as the crystal is basically like this giant hallway of doors, in that each door would lead to a different universe, right? And if you were to crack the M'Kraan crystal or crack one of the doors, so to speak, that would basically lead to the collapse of the multiverse, right? So it was an insanely powerful artifact. The idea was that it originally belonged to a race called the M'Kraan, which were ultimately more or less defeated by the Shi'ar, who in turn took the concept of the M'Kraan crystal and then basically repurposed it, said it was a gift given to them by their god Shara and Kithri, and then went forward from there. And so because of the fact that the M'Kraan race itself viewed their birthright as having been stolen by the Shi'ar and then in turn repurposed as their own, they in turn swore to basically destroy the Shi'ar. And so what this did is it offered the perfect opening for Vulcan insofar that he basically led the assault against the M'Kraan race, ultimately ended up defeating them, and then earning not really the right of leadership so much as greater approval in the eyes of the Shi'ar Empire. And that basically sort of turned the tide a little further in his favor in terms of winning those individuals over who were still loyal to Lilandra. But the circumstance surrounding this was that following that, what you ended up going into was the War of Kings. Now, something that I do want to point out here is that for a lot of the events that were going on with regards to the X-Men themselves, X-Men Divided We Stand and Messiah Complex and things like that, that was all basically Ed Brubaker along with a handful of others who were focusing on those stories. And for the most part, Vulcan didn't really have any goings on with that. Instead, there were some stories like X-Men Kingbreaker that basically focused on the idea of Vulcan having essentially won over the Shi'ar Empire and then in turn imprisoning Lilandra and then beginning this sort of conquest of expansion, which is to say expanding the Shi'ar Empire out I guess outside of its existing borders. But what this did is it really coincided with the expansion of the Inhumans themselves. And the reason why was because the Inhumans in Marvel Comics had long since existed as this essential experiment by the Kree, right? The way this played out during, I want to say it was Jonathan Hickman's run on the Fantastic Four is when this was explained, is that in the early days of Earth, that of course you had the Celestials who showed up, who modified the genes of early man and so on and so forth, created the Deviants and the Eternals, and then baseline humans who would eventually go on to become mutants. Around that same time, the Kree were at war with the Skrulls. And because of the fact that Earth is in this strategic location between these two races, insofar that whatever race conquers Earth will gain a foothold over the other in this, Kree-Skrull war that's been going on for millennia, for countless eons. This basically led to the Kree viewing Earth and then taking some of those individuals and bringing them into the Inhuman Project. Now, the Inhuman Project was actually a universal-wide project. The idea behind this, though, for the Kree was to essentially create a circumstance whereby they could genetically modify individuals so that when they were exposed to the equivalent of Earth's Terrigen Mist, that their true form would manifest. And then as agents of the Kree, they would go forward in whatever race they matched, and then in turn, infiltrate it. Ultimately, because of the fact that there was so much uncertainty and because the Supreme Intelligence, who was the leader of the Kree, believed the race's destruction would come at the hands of one of their Inhuman experiments, it essentially ordered the disbanding and the destruction of all the experiments. At that point, the Inhumans essentially survived the whole attempt at a purge and then just resided on Earth for eons. The problem is that in a lot of ways, and not even to really rag on the Inhumans, but in a lot of ways, they were always kind of viewed as a poor man's X-Men and Marvel. And so nothing really ever seemed to come of them. And indeed, up until this point, the only really good Inhumans run you saw was Volume 2 by Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee. In order to kind of shake things up, the Inhumans essentially ended up leaving Earth and then traveling to the Kree Empire. At that point in time, the Kree was being led by Ronan the Accuser, who was challenged by Black Bolt, and whoever won would basically take over leadership. If Ronan won, he would continue in his role. If Black Bolt won, he would take over leadership. The result is that Black Bolt ended up winning, and so ultimately the Kree Empire fell under the control of the Inhumans. But because it was a newly conquered empire essentially and in a relatively weakened state, Vulcan was written during the War of Kings to making his move against the Kree, which led to a massive battle against the Kree themselves, as well as the Shi'ar Empire led by Vulcan. Now, War of Kings itself was a pretty significant event. It was a pretty massive conflict when you consider the grand scope of everything that was involved. And the reason why I say that was that at the time under Dan Abnett, a lot of events had taken place, right? Vulcan was only one part of it. In 2006, you ended up getting Annihilation. The following year, you ended up getting Annihilation Conquest. There were a lot of things that were happening. With War of Kings, because of the fact that this was designed to be just kind of another event going on in an ongoing series of events, Vulcan, while he was leader of the Shi'ar, wasn't really seen as a long-term individual in Marvel Comics. And in reality, it sort of made sense, right? Not so far in that the cosmic scope is where you went to when you wanted to cancel characters, but insofar that putting him there really offered Marvel the position of testing the waters and seeing how fans responded as far as this character went. The reality of Vulcan is that while his powers were really intriguing, which is to say the ability to manipulate any kind of energy, while he was Omega level and that was cool, the reality of this was that Marvel's cosmic scope was in a lot of ways dwarfing the popularity of what was going on Earth. And so really in a lot of ways, Vulcan just kind of fell to the wayside. And this all came to a head at the end of the War of Kings event when Vulcan and Black Bolt officially went to war, right? It was technically Vulcan who made the first strike when he interrupted the marriage between Ronan the Accuser and Crystal of the Inhumans, which would unite the Kree and the Inhuman tribes. When that whole attack was launched by Vulcan, it basically set in motion the war that was initiated between the two of them. But with Black Bolt and really with this conflict, kind of ripping a hole in space, basically, this essentially saw the quote unquote defeat of Vulcan, where he was essentially just kind of shuffled out, which is to say he was written out in the sense that he was sucked into a void, never really to be seen or heard from again, at least as far as we were aware. What this did is it just kind of allowed Dan Abnett to continue on, now removing Vulcan from the equation, throwing the Shi'ar in a disarray as far as leadership went, and then just kind of going forward from there. The reality is that it led to Gladiator taking over the Shi'ar, becoming the new Magister, and then he was the one kind of running the show. But it also went into the Thanos Imperative storyline, right? Where out of that rift that was created during War of Kings came the Cancerverse. But it's one of the things to understand is that following the events of War of Kings and going into House of X, which is to say what's going on right now with Jonathan Hickman, Vulcan was gone. He hadn't been around since then, right? So really for the last 10 years, Vulcan had been missing in action from Marvel Comics. And it's one of the things that people tend to forget, right? They think about the character of Vulcan in Marvel and they believe that he's always kind of been there, right? Really when he was only around for about 3 or 4 years, that they think that he'd been around for 10, 15 years, running all the way up until right now. And that was never really the case. He was a character that appeared for a very brief amount of time. He had some really, really cool stories and he had some huge moments, but he was by no means one of the great, big, huge, long-lasting characters in Marvel. Having said that, the fact that he's here during the events of House and Powers of X indicates there's going to be a big role to play, right? Bringing a character like that back onto the board is no small thing. You're talking about a guy who can manipulate any form of energy out there. And so when you're talking about a character like that, with him showing up alongside the X-Men, they could basically curtail virtually any threat that exists out there because Vulcan himself has faced off against some pretty heavy hitters. But in terms of what we'll see with his character, it's Jonathan Hickman, right? So it's anybody's guess. The beauty, but the struggle of Jonathan Hickman writing is that where you think he's going to go right, you may kind of be he might go right, but most likely he'll go left, and he doesn't do either. He goes straight, and so it's kind of like, all right, I guess we'll just sort of see how this goes. So there's no real guessing with that. But the idea here is that Vulcan is currently back. We don't know what role he plays. There really seems to be no indication, at least in terms of his mannerisms or any references, that he was ever like in control of the Shi'ar Empire, that he ever tried to like destroy Cyclops or any of those guys or anything along those lines. Everything's copacetic. And so it's kind of interesting to see how that's going to be reconciled with his past. If it's reconciled at all, it may just be that he's there and Hickman never does anything with him. But regardless of the circumstance, it is cool to see him back. That's more or less Vulcan explained. Again, he's only around for about 3 or 4 years. Not a great big huge amount of history there. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.